welcome everyone to the One Society Network seminar series. As you probably know by now, my name is Dr. Ellen Rafferty. I'm a health economist at the Institute of Health Economics and co-investigator and project manager of the One Society Network, and I'll be moderating the event today. And just for the people who haven't had a chance to attend the seminar series yet, the One Society Network is one of a number of funded emerging infectious disease modeling networks, and it consists of researchers from across Canada working to understand the broad multi-sectoral impacts of infectious diseases like COVID-19 and related public health policies. And the goals of the introductory seminar that you're attending today is to really give an overview of the dynamic connections between pandemics and diverse aspects of society. So we've had a few talking about healthcare and the macroeconomy, and today we're going to be talking about transportation. So before we begin, I'll give you a quick review of some of the housekeeping. So probably similar to a lot of the events you attend, but you'll be muted throughout the webinar, but feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts or have any comments. We do ask that you submit your questions to the Q&A function instead of the chat. And this just helps us organize all the questions, and then we can answer them kind of in order, and this will be done at the end of the presentation, but feel free to enter your questions as we go. Really looking forward to a lively discussion today. So as I mentioned, today's seminar is around transportation and is titled Not a Monolith, Transportation and the Pandemic. And I'm really pleased to welcome our presenter, Dr. Kate Harback. Kate is an Associate Director of Economics at the Institute of Health Economics in Alberta, so my boss. And as an economist, she has over 15 years of experience working on and leading work in applied microeconomics. In addition to health economics, her work has focused in the fields of transportation, computable general equilibrium, and environmental economics. So you can really see how it applies here. And her work at IHE includes managing economic research for Alberta Health, leading IHE's portfolio of economic evaluation work on mental health interventions, as well as overseeing diverse projects for regional governments, nonprofits, and universities. So leveraging her previous experience in aviation and transportation economics, she is leading the efforts focused on transportation within the One Society Network, and we're really excited about that. So Dr. Kate Harback received her PhD in economics from the University of Delaware, so we stole her from the US, I am happy to say. And from 2018 to 2021, she served as the chair of the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board Aviation Economics and Forecasting Committee. I think they need a shorter name, and remains a member of that group. So I will hand it over to Kate now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for showing up for transportation. Obviously chose kind of a grandiose title, but first I want to start out with thanking Megan Wiggins, who has helped a lot as a practicum student at IHE, Ellen Rafferty, who just did that lovely introduction, and Danica Walensky, who you saw a couple weeks ago present on the healthcare sector. All instrumental in framing my thinking on this and keeping the efforts going. So starting out, I think folks who have attended other elements of this series will be familiar with the idea of One Society. It's been presented a number of times. I think it's worth refreshing here. The idea started with thinking about building connections between infectious disease models and other kinds of modeling, working across the economy to have kind of a broader context on the information that can be provided to inform public health policy. Obviously, transportation is just one part of the economy, but it also connects to a lot of other parts of the economy. All of agricultural outputs, unless you grow them in your own yard, have to be transported. All of the supply chain issues we've heard about during the pandemic may have transportation elements informing them. Workforce, where are people working from? Are they commuting? And then likewise, all of that ending up being reflected in environmental impacts because, transportation activities often generate a lot of emissions. as well as other environmental factors like noise, if you're talking about aircraft. So it's a heavy lift, covering all of this domain. And we have a lot of partners. IHE is just one element, working with many universities, and happy for the help, although none of them take any blame if there's anything that you don't like about this presentation. So just getting the monolith content out of the way, if you stumbled in here because of the title and you were expecting some stuff about monoliths, the whole point is transportation is many, many things, not a monolith. Promise not to reference monoliths ever again in this presentation. So kind of outlining the way I want to walk through this, I want to do it in two parts. I want to start with the experience of the pandemic by transportation sectors, first working through data, and then with a few notes on how transportation has had some really neat adaptation and innovation along the way. And then in the second half, I'd like to talk about frames of reference for the different facets of transportation, and thinking about them and trying to make some of that thinking systematic to support the One Society efforts in connecting with different transportation models and people doing work in that area. So the experience side. We know that a lot of the sector level experience has been, largely considered in the frame of economic impact and what's been happening to the economy and those different industries that compose the economy. And transportation and warehousing can be examined in terms of its contribution to gross domestic product. Economists love GDP because it's basically the output of our economy in goods and services, all of the stuff available to support our standard of living. And these numbers are indexed to June of 2019. These are indexed from annualized numbers represented by month. So there could be some subtlety and seasonality in there, but it shouldn't be too bad. And so as you might predict, we can see in this plot that, there's a marked downward turn in March of 2020. Kind of beginning a bit before and heading in there, and some recovery. So this is just, I wouldn't even say it's the tip of the iceberg, because there's the actual experience of specific transportation sectors lies on both sides of this. There's a bunch of sectors that were much less affected than this aggregate view would show, and then there's some sectors that were much more heavily impacted. So getting to that with more detail and alluding to not a monolith again. If we want to consider pipeline transportation, not a big dip there. If we want to look at rail transportation, again, modest compared to that overall time series. And then likewise, water transport. Rail and water transport are things that are largely freight oriented. Yes, there is some passenger rail. And then there's also transit rail that's counted in a different part of this data set. And they move with the economy. So anytime there's kind of a downturn in the economy, they might experience a downturn. Rail can also be subject to some shifting between truck and rail, but also a lot of things go by both truck and rail intermodal. In general, the things going by rail or by water are bigger, heavier, and not in a hurry. So a lot of agriculture in the rail, but not a lot of like delicate, high dollar value goods. And truck experienced more of a downturn, but also not dipping as far as that overall series did. But then when we consider urban transit systems and air transport, that's where we see these huge declines. Aviation just absolutely gutted on the passenger side. A little bit insulated on the cargo side, but still it was significant. And so just to pop that original plot back on top to see there's, amongst these modes, almost like a bimodal experience, with a bunch of them experience much more mild impacts and then the very passenger-centric modes just gutted. And recovery has begun. You see it especially accelerating in the period, and these numbers are for Canada alone, so different experience in different countries. But as vaccines start to become more widespread, you see this big uptick. And I wish I had the data that went to the present, but that was as far as I could get into last fall. So GDP, again, great if you're interested in economic impact, but there's a lot of transportation activities that don't get summed up in GDP. So for example, people commuting to work in their own cars are considered household produced transportation. You know, you don't necessarily think of paying yourself a fare when you're driving yourself to work, but it is still productive economic activity that may not be adequately counted in GDP facing data sets. But there is other data that we can look at. Oh, but first, if you were curious how big those were relative to each other, trucking is pretty big. Air transport is also pretty big. If you measured these by volume, air transport, like by weight, air transport would be a tiny sliver and water would be huge. So just giving you some context on how large each of those sectors are as components of transportation and warehousing. But getting to that other data that's available, Google made mobility data available early in the pandemic and throughout at a community level to inform decision makers and characterize what was going on in different communities. I know some researchers have used it to inform updates to contact matrices for purposes of doing the underlying disease modeling. And I think the data is really interesting. The window available in Google is kind of a shorter time frame on a sliding basis, but some other data providers have been gathering that as it posts so that you can get this longer time series. And so starting out, these are indexed to where 0 is kind of the baseline, and we move across and we see, and again, not adjusted for seasonality, that people are at home more in the pandemic, especially heading into March of 2020 than they were before. But people being home isn't that interesting from a transportation perspective. What's more interesting is seeing how people are going to grocery and pharmacy and to, sorry, Zoom is blocking my labels, retail and recreation, as well as workplaces and transit stations. And so that evidence of people being at transit stations is an interesting complement to transit as a element in GDP in the prior graphs. And the retail and recreation is, I think, also really interesting that it seems to have come back faster than workplaces. And a lot of these big spikes, you know, if you get into the granular data, you can see this is kind of winter holiday season where we have workplaces down and we have retail up and then down and grocery up and then down. And some of these different dips correspond to holidays when people were more likely to be away from work. And so that's, I think, a nice complement to thinking about the GDP data. So GDP measured in dollars, the Google mobility data indexed to where people are and where they were at the beginning of the period. There's also other ways of accounting for transportation activity through data. A lot of my examples are going to be focused on aviation because that's the place where I have the most experience and pay the most attention naturally. This is interesting because it matches up very well with the GDP data when we count it as passengers. And you can see that a lot of the economic value there is dominated by the passenger piece. This slices it out into 3 different kinds of passengers. We have domestic passengers, international, and then US Canadian passengers, which is a subset of the international that's focused on movements between US and Canada. And it's kind of interesting to see the slope on the domestic, with the domestic maybe coming back a little more steeply than the other series. to make them more easy to compare. We can index them at the same point. Also worth noting, this is not seasonally adjusted. So in these places where we have little local peaks, it's summer, and we tend to travel more in summer. And it's interesting to see in this chart, you can see pretty well, there's not that much difference between the US, Canada, and the international in general in that experience or in the recovery. And again, wish I had closer to the present on this. Continuing and thinking about, additional data, this is aggregated for Canada. There's a lot of data that also exists at the airport level. So if we want to examine the experience of different regions and even sub-regions, we can look at that, and because it's described. But it isn't the only kind of data, this kind of GDP, Google mobility, airport operations, passenger counts. There's also other important sources of data to think about. And I think schedule data is one of the most interesting because it's not observational. So all of those others are observational. The schedule is kind of, yeah, you can observe it, but we also publish it and print it ahead. And so it has interesting information on what the decision makers think is going to happen across the course of the pandemic. And there are some folks I know who have done some work over the course of the pandemic, examining airline schedules through data sources like the official airline guide, who aggregate, I just liked this old-timey image. It's actually very contemporary and all online now. To look at how, from March 2020 through the subsequent years, airlines have scheduled the flights, and then as they come closer to the date of operation, how are they trimming flights out? How are they replacing big aircraft with smaller aircraft? How are they making changes in their network and how they're flowing passengers to origins and destinations through different hubs? And it's really interesting stuff. And last summer was a time when people were scrutinizing this and kind of thinking about like, okay, people are planning more. Is it coming back? So it's not just kind of a ex post data set. It's a little bit of a look ahead. That's something maybe more solid than doing a pure forecast. In some ways, if you do think it's aligned with planning and decision making. And even absent the pandemic, airline schedules change over time as you approach the date of the flight. You may have experienced that when you got an update from your airline that you weren't going to be flying exactly the same way you thought you booked, if you booked very far in advance. But it's important to note schedule data isn't just useful for airlines. It's also useful for other modes that have predictable operations where they create a schedule and they operate it. And I think it's really interesting to think about transit schedules because it's not the same thing as an airline. They can adjust this on the daily without too much fuss compared to, the planning in advance that goes into flowing flights across an airline network. And it's interesting to think about what the different changes would be over the course of the pandemic, of were cities looking for savings in terms of operating fewer buses and rail cars, or were they leaving capacity there to promote distancing? It's something I'm sure there's work being done on. I haven't worked on it extensively or looked at it too much, but the schedule data is an important data source. So then next, moving away from consideration of the data and thinking about some of the innovation that's happened and adaptation. There was a lot made of efforts to use passenger planes to do more cargo. Over the course of the pandemic, especially in 2020, there were a lot of news stories with photos like this of what traditionally might be carried in the belly of a plane also being carried in the cabin. It's not necessarily clear that made a huge difference to airlines' bottom lines, but every little bit helped. And this photo is largely, I believe, postal cargo. Again, on adaptation, there's been a lot made of the reliance on delivery services within cities, and it's definitely an important form of transportation. And there's some question as to how patterns in that will persist and what the implications of that are. And this was just an interesting study I happened to see because I know one of the researchers, and they divided, this kind of urban small delivery bespoke, often facilitated by apps, into 4 consumer types. Prior adopters, so maybe people who were using Uber Eats on the regular before the pandemic, temporary adopters who maybe wanted to minimize their risk going places during the pandemic, but then were ready to be out in the world as soon as they could, and then permanent new adopters, so they weren't using it before, they started using it during the pandemic, and it's going to persist, and then non-adopters, people who did not use the delivery apps, people who weren't before, weren't during, weren't after. And they said there was a lot of heterogeneity amongst the user groups, and people were pretty distributed. And in addition to consumer types, they also explored this across product types. So grocery delivery, food delivery, which would be more like prepared food than grocery. So restaurants carry out. Home goods, and other. There's also people looking at phenomenon during the pandemic to think about implications for future transportation planning. And Victoria Transport Policy Institute has done several really interesting papers on this. Thinking about what the lessons were from the pandemic, how that can be folded into, really promoting resilience in community transportation and enhancing transit with these lessons for the future. And then we will come to consideration of framework. So moving away from marching through the experience of the pandemic and starting to talk about how, with all these facets and all the modes and all the different views of looking at it, what can we make of this for how we might connect to different threads to promote future enhanced decision-making, connections between models, understanding trade-offs of different policies. And, I'm an economist, I've worked in health, I've worked with systems engineers, I've worked in aviation, and so you're getting a matrix, I'm so sorry. But, sometimes rows and columns are a way to make sense of things. And I like this lens because we can think about the modes, and then we can think about what we're looking at moving, and different aspects of modeling and behavior will depend on what's being moved. Are we thinking about passengers? Are we thinking about goods? Or are we looking at vehicles? And then on the behavior side, there's some other layers to add to this. Are we thinking about commercial, public, or household produced transportation? Are we thinking about business, school, or recreation as the purpose of going somewhere? And are there degrees of substitutability? Sometimes there are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes how much substitutability there is a property of the goods being shipped. Sometimes it's a cost consideration. We don't tend to ship huge amounts of coal by air because by weight, it's just not cost effective. Passengers on the demand side will face a degree of substitutability that may depend on what options are available to them and this could break on socioeconomic lines as well, of who has cars, who lives near transit stations, what is the access available. And so there's a lot of nuance in there. If we want to really be simple about it, we can say what's moving how is it moving? Why is it moving? Where is it moving? And that might reduce that matrix perspective for the underlying behavior. But then there's also the consideration of connecting to existing models. And models across transportation serve many, many, many purposes. You can have micro simulation of like a daily rush hour in a city, and you can have 40-year forecasts of demand for purposes of infrastructure planning and making big investments in construction of transport capacity. So there's a whole range of things that are possible to consider there. And that purpose will inform the granularity of the modeling and the time scale of the modeling, and what are the inputs, what are the outputs. And so how any efforts in this space connect with that whole spectrum of models depends on what they're trying to get out of it and how they're trying to measure the trade-offs and the impacts of different policy questions or different scenarios around infectious disease. I do think it's worth noting that, like, in all the complexity, one of the most important concepts in kind of predicting behavior around transportation is a simple elasticity. And I think you can get a lot of mileage out of that in terms of informing related modeling. But still, there's like layers and layers and layers and layers of consideration, and, you know, the matrix of matrices that's implied by that can be kind of confounding. But I do think there are good opportunities, and this is how we're directing the efforts under the banner of transportation in the One Society network, to capture that information, characterize by modes, geography, detail, methods, purpose, and scope, the modeling framework associated with the different modes of transportation in a way that's useful to the network. And at a next layer down, getting to some specific models that are particularly accessible, that could be folded into broader considerations, and building to a more nuanced conceptual framework with some different logic models around what the experience was of the pandemic through the different push and pull factors around the phenomenon behavior as the pandemic played out. And the most mature element of this that we've been working on is by taxonomy. We have started to kind of break this down in detail. It's not complete yet, but I can preview it to you, how we're seeing it kind of shaping out, and what we've recorded to date. And this is at a very high level for purposes of not bogging you down. So starting with aviation, we can have a very long-term strategic planning timeframe with the purpose of understanding airspace capacity. We could do general aviation, which is like the non-commercial parts, not thinking of airlines there. Activity at airports for planning, and then profit maximization. So we're thinking about, in aviation, there will be models for an organization like NAV Canada that has to provide air traffic control services. Maybe in a municipal region, there'll be an airport level set of models, and then the airlines themselves have, in many cases, very complex models, thinking about how they're going to get the most out of their assets and their network. In the midterm, you can think about aircraft routing, how you assign forecasting passengers, and then how you're going to assign those passengers to your fleet, what kind of purchases you're going to make for your fleet, big planes, small planes, how long are you going to hold, would do a model to determine how long you're going to hold on to older aircraft versus replacing them with more fuel efficient models. And then even thinking about people getting on and off planes, there can be models. In the short term and the near term, crew scheduling is huge. It's a place where I think there's some overlap with staff scheduling in all kinds of other sectors, including healthcare. it's especially relevant to healthcare because in both cases there can be big safety elements to the staffing aspects. And yeah, day of airport operations. So then moving along beyond aviation, public transport, again, huge range of long-term, midterm, and short-term options. Thinking about how you come up with the schedule, how you maintain the vehicles, what are the timetables, how much capacity for future passengers are you needing to build for. Rail, likewise, rail is it's operated as a network, and the infrastructure has less fluidity than maybe some others with the tracks, and thinking about within all that infrastructure, it's generally privately owned, and how people are agreeing to use it. Marine is, again, lots of choices in terms of consideration of models and across the time horizons. And then personal vehicle and truck, there are more than these, but like I said, we're still populating and thinking about, out of all of these, which will be the most relevant for folks to connect to. And it will depend on who's doing the connecting. Folks asking environmental questions will probably be very interested in traffic levels. Folks asking about transmission might be more interested in some of those network properties of the different modes that are passenger oriented, understanding how things could propagate. And it's interesting on that one because there is a prior literature predating even the more contemporary vectors that we've thought about and diseases. Like there's a lot of literature in aviation on SARS, but even going back a little further, there have been different periods, waves of studies being done on things like dengue and malaria and what you can do to keep mosquitoes off planes and things like that. So there is also a rich history of investigation and modeling that goes back for quite a ways to think about in framing future questions. And again, it's early days, so that's what we've got. But I am happy to try to answer anyone's questions about any of the graphs for the experience or differing modeling frameworks. But that is the end of these slides.
Thanks so much, Kate. We did have a really quick question just asking about how slide 9, which I think was the Google mobility slide, was indexed. I thought other people might have had the same question. So.
Yeah, and I meant to dig into that. And I believe that what we're seeing is kind of percent deviation from a baseline in this one. I did not calculate the index from a level. This is how I downloaded it, and I meant to go back and create a little tag to say what the indexing scheme was, but my recollection was that it was baseline 0, and this was the percent deviation around it.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, we have a few questions coming in, just again, encouraging people to throw their questions in the Q&A function. So one from John is, there are certain components of transportation that might be considered essential services. Are there some public policy protective measures, including things like financial supports to companies, that the public payers governments should put in place to address infrastructure protection in the area of transportation to ensure viability?
Yeah, well, they did. So I think NAV Canada is a good example of this. In Canada, we have a corporatized provision of air traffic control services. That means NAV Canada is kind of its own entity that is trying to operate like a business, as opposed to in the United States, it is a government function directly to provide the air traffic control around the world. it's very common. UK NATS operates the same way. New Zealand does as well. There's various places that do that model for air navigation service provision. It generally then runs on user fees. And so if your entire revenue is based on user fees and you experience this for your, airspace utilization, far fewer users, that represents kind of a collapse of a revenue base that was sustaining an essential function, air traffic control. And so obviously something like COVID-19 was not considered when, you institute a service like that that's based on user fees. And so if you look in the news, you can see stories about Nav Canada taking advantage of some of the supports that the federal government had made available for all kinds of services, employers and businesses to stay afloat. So a lot of those supports and subsidies that kept many elements of the economy going were also used by critical transportation sectors. And obviously the airlines as well took advantage of that. Urban transit, it's a little different. You would expect them to be getting more local support, but it's possible some of those got federal support as well. I'd have to look into that.
Great, really interesting example. Another question we had come in is where, or are there models, I guess, or transport models for the short-term purpose of moving patients to other jurisdictions for treatment because of overcapacity at hospitals, through air, private airlines, car? Were there people looking at that?
I'm sure there were. I haven't seen it yet. But again, I haven't been so far through this activities deeply in the literature yet. But I'm sure it was. I do think that idea of having different constraints, different capacity, different places, and trying to move past patients around to where there might be capacity is pretty interesting. This idea that demand is peaky and you may get congested outcomes at different times is something transportation has in common with healthcare. So I do think there's opportunities to examine that. In the decision, for example, to send like hip and knee replacement patients abroad where there may be more capacity, I don't think transportation costs have been the dominant consideration in that. But I do think it's interesting to consider and dig into.
And Aaron Kerwin has a question on transport GDP and whether growth was increasing prior to the series start or whether it was stable.
Yeah, in general, there's relatively stable long-term relationships between the transportation sectors and GDP because transportation is a derived demand. And so it comes from economic activity, whether that's shipping the goods or in terms of recreation. The more income and wealth we have, the more we value leisure and the more we want to travel. There is some literature that investigates whether there's a saturation effect in that and that eventually passenger growth will not hold those long-term relationships with GDP because you can only travel so many times in a year. That hasn't played out entirely yet, that saturation theory. But yeah, in general, growth in transportation would track pretty well with GDP.
Perfect. Another question, is there any work on the time-space constraints by mode, especially for commuting?
I could think of a few ways to interpret that question, but all of them would be yes. And I do know there's people working commuting questions with respect to patterns of real estate use after the pandemic, and thinking about the hollowing out of cities and what elements of commuting and downtown core will come back and what won't. And that's a place where some of the transportation questions are really tied up in future workforce questions and patterns of real estate use. And yeah, there's definitely work there. I wouldn't say it's exclusively transportation centric. Like I said, there's a lot of employment and workplace policy stuff around that as well, if I'm interpreting that in one of the ways I would think of. But feel free to get more specific in the Q&A if I missed the flick of what you were asking.
Yes, definitely. And are those models generally often connected? So when you're talking about the real estate and transportation, do they connect those models when they're looking at it?
Yeah, historically, there's definitely been, because like, for example, I mean, I'm going to pivot to aviation naturally, the place I have the most experience. There's a lot of cities around the world that have more than one airport. Washington, D.C. is a good example. Baltimore Washington International is up north. You've got Reagan National in the center of the city, and then you've got Dulles kind of out to the west in Virginia. And you can look at a broad metro area, how many passengers they are and how you expect them to be having demand to travel to different cities around the world from there. But then the idea of like, okay, well, which airport are they going to naturally go to? And at what like price point in fares would they switch airports? Like there are people that live in Baltimore that will drive to Dulles to get a really cheap flight to go to Europe, for example. And so there's a lot of like geographic population density relating to those airports, and proximity and understanding that stuff that has existed historically for forecasting, and definitely in planning like roads and transit and population density and where those masses of people are located has always been considered. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I would say yes, then, in that context.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And this is kind of similar to a question I had. So have these transportation frames, or where, I guess, have you seen these transportation frames connected to the flow of COVID? And could they be used for the purposes of prediction?
I would say, so again, I haven't deeply engaged with the literature on this yet. There's definitely people working it. And I mean, not to sound flip, but like COVID didn't swim to Canada, right? It probably flew. And so there's definitely aspects of that. And I've seen it historically for other things like SARS and prior infectious disease events. And so how mature that literature is right now, I'm not sure. But I'm sure stuff exists.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, I couldn't be more helpful on that.
I've definitely seen, I forget where it was, but models of how common flights are between different countries, and and how that could connect to infectious disease spread. So if you have kind of a new infection in a certain country, where is that most likely to spread next? So models around that.
Yeah,
and I don't know if it was specifically for COVID, but for other infections.
For other things too, yeah. And there's also been kind of forward-looking forecasting work on like how passenger demand will come back that tries to take into account potentially infection rates at one end and infection rates at the other end, and with respect to different policies to see, will travelers be going to Europe in droves, or will they not, and trying to make what the infection rates are in the destination a factor in predicting that demand. I don't know how well those have performed though.
Yeah, and Erin just made a comment in the Q&A. I asked her to put the name in the chat of somebody who, oh, I put it on her wrong question. Somebody who does some of this work on importation and transportation.
Excellent.
Julian Arino, I think is how you say their names. But if you're more interested in that, that might be somebody to look up.
Excellent.
Okay, and one other question is, do you have any, so do these models or transportation models and infectious diseases generally add government policy regarding the transportation? And if you were to create a model, would you consider that?
Would I consider incorporating whatever the government policy is into the modeling? I think you'd have to. I mean, even if you were just doing kind of time series regression modeling, you'd have different regime changes. Essentially, you'd have to think about structural breaks across time, and that's kind of the simplest possible modeling I can think of to do of this. And you would be missing a huge source of explanatory information by not accounting for that in your models. So yeah, I think you'd have to. It can represent a challenge if you're trying to get some kind of lens on underlying behavior and you've never observed the behavior absent the interventions. You know, if you don't have a really clean kind of, your data doesn't look like a natural experiment in that way. But yeah, I think you would definitely have to. I would. I think it's critical.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I had a question about, just based on your knowledge of I know you attended a talk with a lot of airlines involved. How concerned are they about the spread of infectious diseases on their, you know, what for the future of their companies, and how are they dealing with that?
I think it depends who you ask, when you ask. I think if you know, we're talking to them in April, June of 2020, you know, the things were pretty dire. And, you know, as mentioned before, there were government supports for employers who were hit particularly hard. But I think as vaccines became more available, and I think particularly now where you see restrictions dropping quickly across Canada and around the world, people are maybe a little more optimistic. I do think there will be a greater degree of monitoring and thinking about this stuff, but there's also sometimes a disconnect between value to shareholders and really long-term thinking. And that's something we've talked about in the context of One Society before. But yeah, I think there are folks along the way that have thought this is an existential threat, and if not to the whole industry, at least to individual operators. Most managed to stay afloat, especially in North America. And yeah, I think I answered the question.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So there is a question, and I think maybe if you could talk a bit more about the goal of the matrix and the logic model, because I think people seem to think you're going to be creating your own model, but
I do not have resources to build a massive model of all of transportation with all of the connections that are possible. That's just not, you know, so the value of this effort is going to be trying to provide is some thinking around how you could connect, and the expression of how you could connect will be in that kind of logic model framework of this, the knee bones connected to the leg bone kind of framing to help stimulate thinking on those broader connections, because Yeah, I wouldn't advise doing a master transportation model that does everything endogenously and at like a high level of detail. There are stylized options for working that way that exist. We mentioned computable general equilibrium models in the intro, and that's a place where you have the economy operating with all of the transportation modes represented and some ability to see on how factors push on each other. But in terms of what we're producing for this effort, it'll be more informative than an actual model to help people across the network and working otherwise think about what they could do and what resources they could access and what already exists so they don't have to reinvent the wheel in framing those connections.
Yeah, and I think that's we talked about it, and we had realized that there's so many different ways that all the different sectors connect with transportation that they might want to consider in their own models. So this was a way to get that information into people's hands who maybe wouldn't have included that piece without it. So
yeah, and we've provided some support for folks working in agriculture in particular and trying to help them chase down some data to characterize some of the movements in livestock. I don't think there was a ton of information that existed, but yeah, it's still acting as a resource to connect folks with that transport data.
And as Chris mentioned in the chat, that we will be pursuing additional funding opportunities so we can develop applications for one or more of the frameworks. That would be great, but you don't get all of OSN's money, Kate.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, I think that's all. Oh, Chris Cotton has a question. And I think you could just come. Yeah, just come.
Yeah, I'll just come in.
Hi,
I was trying to put it. I was trying to put it in the Q&A, and I like spent a while trying to figure that out without being able to, since I'm a panelist.
You're allowed to talk. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me talk instead of type. So you were talking about the disruptions in terms of like the disease and how the airlines have, at least in North America, seem to survive. But are they particularly worried about like COVID has prompted the knowledge that we don't need to travel across the country for a 3-hour meeting? And
so yeah, and you especially if you do kind of a cursory glance at headlines, around that, you can see huge focal points in what people are talking about. And I'm not even talking about like journals rigorous stuff. I'm just talking about industry prognostication. And yeah, there've been a lot of people announcing the death of business travel. But at the same time, I'm talking to people and like conferences are back. Like I know a lot of folks that are traveling for conferences this summer. So the proof will be in the pudding, right? Like it'll play out how it plays out. And I think it will always be more mixed than people predict from that headline level. And then again, last summer, there were all these headlines, get ready for revenge travel. Like, I guess people were supposed to be getting revenge on the pandemic by doing, vacations at a higher rate than normal. And a lot of folks have talked about pent up travel demand. And so it's going to be like last summer and this summer, like very busy with the wedding travel for all the weddings that would have happened in the year anyway. And plus weddings that were delayed and things like that. So I think there is something to that. There's some pent up demand on the kind of visits to family and weddings and just,
Right. But I was more interested in like the long term, like
long term?
not over the next 3 years, but like 5 years from now, just knowing that
Yeah.
So
I mean,
it's not clear.
The business travel side, I think it's the most vulnerable. On the other side, it will depend on risk aversion and people, whether it returns to tracking with GDP, which would be my prediction, that there will be, unless there's, significant other variants and things like that, that it'll keep getting back there. But then, the business travel, I think it'll be incredibly mixed. And people have said it's done. Business travel's done. We're not going to do it again. But then anecdotally, it looks like we're doing it again. So, yeah.
Thanks. And there was one quick other question or request, I guess, is once if you could put any references you have at the end of the slides, and then when we post it, we can make sure those are available.
I can do
to
that. Yeah,
everyone.
I have them noted on each slide, but we can also gather them at the end.
Perfect. Okay, so I think that is all the questions we have today, which is good because we're running out of time. So thank you again, Kate, for a great presentation, and everyone for attending OSN's introductory seminar. So the next one will be April 7th, and we'll be talking about the dynamic connections between pandemics and the interprovincial response. And if you wish to collaborate with the One Society Network, please visit our webpage and reach out, and we would be happy to collaborate. So thanks everyone again.